So Ernst Karel comes to us from the Film Study and the Sensory Ethnography Lab, where he started in 2006 and developed and is teaching a class on sonic ethnography. He received his PhD from the Interdisciplinary Committee on Human Development at the University of Chicago, where he conducted fieldwork in South India, urban South India, on amplified sound. And his work in sort of fieldwork and anthropology continues to inform his work. I first met Ernst at a conference last year where we were in a panel together called Making Noise, Experimental Ethnography in Sensory Publics. It was a lot of fun. And so I was very happy to be able to bring him here. And in some ways that panel was actually the first beginning kernel of thinking about this class. So Ernst Karel's diverse audio practice includes location recording, electroacoustic performance and composition, sound for nonfiction film and video, solo and collaborative sound installations. His experimental documentary work, in it he structures unprocessed location recordings of infrastructural processes to convey a sense of lived experience and of place. So we can think about this. We heard about Feld's recordings last week. We can think about this in relation to that sense of place. The recent multi-channel sound works, including Morning and Other Times, which I believe we're going to hear today, and then Materials Recovery Facility, Swiss Mountain Transport Systems, and Herd Laboratories have been presented in various places, including the 2014 Whitney Biennale, the Film Society at Lincoln Center, the Vienna International Film Festival, KW Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin, and many other locations. He also has recent installations, including an ongoing quadraphonic project, hourly directional sound recordings with Helen Mira, instantiations of which have been exhibited at the São Paulo Biennale and the MIT Visual Arts Center. And he also made a piece with, collaborated with Paulo Wojciak and Toby Kim Lee, called Single Stream, which is a large-scale video and 4-channel audio installation for the Museum of Modern Image in Queens, New York. Moving image, sorry. And then recomposed as a work for cinema with 5.1 surround sound. So, quite a lot. Thank you so much for joining us, and let's welcome Ernst.
Thank you very much for having me. of the famous and vast Hindu temple of Chidambaram, Tamil Nadu, in South India, where the god Shiva is worshipped in his form as Nataraja, Lord of the Dance. I recorded it a long time ago in 1996, and early in my graduate training at the U of BC, as was mentioned. And I start with this because in many ways the experience of doing that research continues to shape the way I think of and work with sound today. So it stemmed from questions about how sounds, in particular non-linguistic and non-musical sounds, might function semiotically, about how sounds mean. So building on my background in studying Indian religions and philosophies, I went to Chidambaram, and for 3 months I spent nearly every day in this Hindu temple, participating in the ritual, listening to the immersive sound of the inharmonic frequencies of these great bells, talking with people there in an effort to try to hear how they heard it. So in trying to understand the sensory experience and conceptual categories of others, I was and remain influenced by the approach of cultural psychology and its pluralist model of human experience. Its assumption that, as my advisor, the anthropologist Richard Schwader, put it, there are multiple objective worlds, and that our task in trying to make sense of this multiplex reality of human diversity is to attempt to view the objective world from many points of view, first from one, then from another, and then another, as we participate in the never-ending process of overcoming partial views. So for this research project and learning about the experiential worlds of the devotees of this temple, the first piece of evidence was the contextualized participatory experience of hearing and listening. So from there, through conversations with a variety of regular participants in temple ritual, I came to fathom the highly elaborate and widely shared network of significations, the relationships between temple ritual, social life, bodily well-being, and aspects of the nature of the divine, all of which were bound up in the way the bell sound is experienced, felt at a phenomenological level. So this was my first foray into the intermix of sound, with sound as thoroughly embedded into networks of cultural models or systems of cultural meaning. So in my mind, it serves as a good example of what Stephen Feld, which many of you have been reading recently, and who more than anyone has defined the area of anthropology of sound, has written about, and how he's written about how sound can be revelatory of place, is called acoustemology, or acoustic knowing, of sounding as a condition of and for knowing, of sonic presence and awareness as potent shaping forces, and how people make sense of their experiences. And this project was also an early foray into the then emerging area of inquiry known as sound studies. You've also been reading lately, as Jonathan Stern broadly defines the field as that the interdisciplinary ferment in the human sciences that takes sound as its analytical point of departure or arrival. In my ongoing practice, though, I've been interested to preserve sounding and listening, not just as a point of departure, but as an integral, essential part of the work itself. So I've combined my interests in the meanings of sounds, in sound recording technologies, and sound as medium, with my interest in sound engineering and my ongoing practice as a musician, to develop a practice in location recording and composing with location recordings as a way of making work which engages with the real. So I'm going to be talking about that kind of thing today. So in a way, this trajectory can be seen in response to the work of Stephen Feld, who asked in an interview that many of you have read recently, what about ethnography in and through sound? What about ethnography as tape editing? He says in the same interview, until the sound recorder is presented and taught as a technology of creative and analytic mediation, which requires craft and editing and articulation just like writing, little will happen of an interesting sort in the anthropology of sound. So I'm going to jump now to my most recent sound piece, which I recorded in the city of Chiang Mai in northern Thailand. And that's a place that I lived for 2 extended periods before graduate school in Chiang Mai with a Thai host family in an immersive language environment which allowed me to become conversational in Thai, and I then continued studying Thai as an undergrad at the University of Washington. And in the last few years I've been returning to my interest in Thai language and culture, and about a year ago spent a month back in the city of Chiang Mai. So this piece is called Morning and Other Times. And in addition to returning to concerns going back to my fieldwork about place as it's meaningfully inhabited, and about the nature of shared social spaces, coincidentally, it also returns to the sound of bells ringing. But this time my attention was drawn to the bells only indirectly. What attracted my ear was the participation of non-human actors in the acoustic life of the city. First of all, the voices of dogs. In Chiang Mai, Buddhist temples provide shelter for stray dogs. And when every morning and afternoon a large bell is rung in the temple to call the resident monastics to engage in the chanting of Buddhist sutras, quite often the nearby dogs will also start howling, or we might say singing, along. Meanwhile, every morning I also noticed, emanating from a large Thai military base near where my partner and I were staying on the outskirts of the city, the amplified sound of a bugle call, audible throughout the surrounding neighborhood, which preceded the sound of soldiers participating in their own collective chanting exercises. And with these bugle calls, too, the neighborhood dogs would sing along. So these were some of the situations I was drawn to record. More than any of my other pieces, this one is about voice, and the piece has us spending time really listening to the individual voices of non-human animals, particularly canine voices, which are literally in dialogue with audible religious and political aspects of Thai society. So I want to open up our thinking about place by attending to the multi-dimensional nature of the city, not just in terms of human multiplicity, but also in terms of the ways it's inhabited by beings of different species. So I'm going to play the whole piece. It's 37 minutes long, and I'll just say that in much of my work I'm interested in duration, and what happens when we allow ourselves to settle into an extended kind of time that's not ours, in which we can enter into a kind of mental space which is not shaped by our normal thought patterns and intentionality, and when we give up the expectation that things are going to move along quickly. Settling into the pace of time from a different place allows a different kind of hearing. Salome Vogelin, in her book about listening to works of sound art, writes, quote, "Listening is a subjective task that demands an attending engagement with the work for the time it plays, rather than the time I'm prepared to listen, and grasps my being to understand that of the work. I am producing the work in my temporal presence, and that might take a while. This while is lonely, and there's no guarantee that any judgment formed will be lasting or communicable." Unquote. I'm just going to talk a lot before I play this. I don't have to talk much after it, so I'll just say a few more things. The piece also plays on overhearing, on listening through, in order to convey something of its setting through what's revealed in the background. So similarly to when a film has established a strategy of working with long takes, and where in recognizing this, as a viewer, one is free to let one's gaze wander about the frame unhurriedly, undirectedly. Here we have the freedom to listen around the auditory field, to shift focus from foreground to background. In fact, when I was going through my recordings some months after making them, I found that I had more than once inadvertently recorded the national anthem being broadcast somewhere in the background. Especially in the wake of last spring's military coup in Thailand, including them in this piece contributes to a theme of a pervasive background of nationalism and militarism. So my approach to documentary is one which is interested in the ground as well as the figure, noise as well as the signal, excess or surplus meaning as well as intended meaning. In the essay Visual Anthropology of and the Ways of Knowing, which probably you're also reading in class, I don't know, but the filmmaker David McDougall writes of the, quote, exploratory response demanded by visual works, unquote, or the principle of discovery at work in visual media, which is what calls on the experiencer to be an active participant in the work. Quote, the discovery of relationships between images linked not only by their proximity, but by their resonances. So he's, of course, talking about audiovisual work. He talks about it as visual work, but none of the stuff he's talking about is silent. And I think what he's saying here is also true for audio-only work, and perhaps even more so, since sound is potentially a far less specific form of representation. Sound work asks even more participation of its audience in terms of a productive, active engagement with doubt and ambiguity. Okay, that's probably too much, but anyway, I already said it.
Do you have a particular lighting scheme you'd like? Lights
Maybe
down?
Jim?
Let's see if we can.
So, just a technical note, you notice probably that it's composed for 5.1. The way we were getting 5.1 is by doing a live, encoding it to Dolby Pro Logic sending it out over a stereo digital thing, and then decoding it to the 5.1 again, which is why the imaging was sometimes weird or shifting suddenly or something like that. And also I think this particular speaker might have a little distortion issue, but anyway. So, moving on. So, moving into some other sound work that is, should I put on the microphone or can people hear me okay? It's okay? Okay. Alan is the only one who can't hear me. Matthew can hear me. Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, we
or-
can turn that on.
Be nice to have
The line.
for me.
Oh, is it this one? No. No, that's just muting. Just an off. I'll just speak up a bit more. I don't seem to see the microphone control.
Sorry.
So I'm going to go into an area of work which is sort of simultaneously about experimental nonfiction and also is also about sort of my interest in electroacoustic music. And first piece I'm going to, oh, I should turn off this setting here. Okay, there we go. So this is the first of what's turning out to be a group of sound pieces that take up processes of scientific investigation, social production of disciplinary knowledge. So as you know, the field of science and technology studies has over the past couple of decades been examining the detailed material practices that constitute technoscience, and primarily in visual terms. So as an experiment, I undertook this project, which is called HERD Laboratories, to consider laboratory research environments as sonic spaces. So I'll play just an excerpt from one track. It's a CD that I made, and this piece was recorded in a variety of scientific labs at Harvard University, where I've been working since 2006, as was mentioned, in a perhaps less scientific lab called the Sensory Ethnography Lab. But in approaching the recording and editing of this piece, I was thinking about observational cinema again. I use mostly handheld rather than static microphones, long takes. I edited it more like picture than like sound, with clear cuts from one shot to the next. And each obvious cut is listed in the CD's liner notes with a time marker and with text that describes exactly what's being studied in each lab. But of course, reading the liner notes is optional, and the piece shapeshifts between documentary and abstract music. It's not because the recordings are manipulated or transformed in the studio, they're not, but because I also thought of the act of recording as improvisation, as performance, as interaction with the sonic as well as the social properties of these spaces. So the laboratory recordings, for me at least, reward close listening on a musical level in terms of microharmonies, complexities of tone and timbre, actions unfolding in time, even while being also straightforwardly documentary. I'll just play a few minutes of this piece. This is track 1 from the laboratories. I don't want that. I want this. So I can't remember if you also read Michel Chion in this class, but Chion, who's a composer and film to sound theorist, in his book Audio Vision, describes 3 modes of listening. The causal listening, where you're listening for what made that sound. The semantic listening, where you're listening for the meaning of a sound, especially in the case of language. It's the most obvious case of that. And the third kind he calls, after Pierre Schaeffer, the sort of person who started musique concrète, he calls reduced listening. Reduced because one's no longer doing either of the other kinds of listening, no longer trying to figure out what made that sound or what it means, no longer cognizing it in that way, but instead engaging aesthetically with the sound itself. So I think we can move fluidly between these. And in this piece, Heard Laboratories, the durational commitment allows for this motion itself, this attention to the act of listening, to become part of the experience. So for me, duration, or entering into a different kind of time, is key to both music and documentary. The composer Morton Feldman once said, quote, "All we composers really have to work with is time and sound, and sometimes I'm not even sure about sound." So the other works I think of in this sort of science and technology studies category are 2 longer-term projects which are currently in progress, which I'm going to play little bits of. Mycological is another composition made with location recordings. Mycology, as you know, is the study of fungi, and some of you will also know that fungi are closer genetically to animals than they are to plants. It's one of the few areas of scientific research, along with astronomy, ornithology, and archaeology, where through their observations, amateurs also make real contributions to the furthering of the field. Here in terms of collecting not only specimens, but more importantly, the ecological data that's necessary for the specimens to have scientific value. So mycological is made from recordings in 3 different kinds of sites. In the herbarium, where historical collections up to 150 years old, contributed by both amateurs and professionals, are archived in paper folios, where they're tended to. In labs studying fungi, where, for example, DNA research is going on. On forays with amateur members of the Boston Mycological Club.
Here, see? Here's one.
Oh, gorgeous. Oh, so
that looks to me more like the nigrescence. You see? Now, yeah. You see the little black veins all on the outer surface?
Yes.
The one we had yesterday didn't have that. But see, these are sort of over the hill, but it doesn't, I don't know. I always associate the spore mass as being a little squidgy.
it looks like the ants are interested in them.
Well, could be anything, but...
Well, I'll take...
it does look like dog poop, I'll grant you that.
So the piece focuses not on fungi themselves, those are quiet, but on the human fascination with the morphology and ecology of a species which is extremely unlike our own. A sound piece where the topic is resolutely not sound, but which uses the materiality of sound to evoke manners of observation of minute details of the natural world, an area of study which attempts to understand the interrelationships of ecology and evolution. So the last history of science, so-called project I'll talk about, is also still in progress, in relatively early stages, and it's based on archival materials about military research that happened at Harvard during World War II in what were called the psychoacoustic lab and the electroacoustic lab. So these were set up under secret, under secret U.S. military contracts in the psychology and physics departments, respectively, in order to study and solve problems that arose in modern mechanized warfare. specifically about communication through microphones and headphones in the high noise environments of fighter and bomber aircraft. In the basement of Memorial Hall, which is a building dedicated to the Civil War dead, during World War II, people working with the Psychoacoustic Lab ran experiments in which they built massive sound systems consisting of noise generators, filters, amplifiers, and loudspeakers. And here you can see the loudspeaker array against that back wall. Those aren't bookshelves back there. In order to replicate as realistically as possible the sonic conditions inside fighter planes. So, okay, let's see here. Let's try this. So in their experiments, they brought in conscientious objectors, people who refused on moral grounds to fight in the war, and had them sit in extremely loud noise, and for 7 hours a day, weeks at a time, performing experimental tasks of different kinds to determine how the noise might affect their performance on these tasks. And listening to lists of words through the masking effect of the noise to determine which words were the most intelligible and were therefore recommended for use in radio communication. Whereas in the lab, with a stated concern for realism, the scientists recreated the sounds of a fighter plane pilot would hear. So for one part of this sound piece in my studio, I'm using analog electronic noise generators and filters to reenact or resynthesize their recreations based on the detailed descriptions and charts in their archived reports. Could you hear me? A little bit? So the lists of words used in the experiments to test for intelligibility, which constitute a kind of unintentional poetry, were pressed onto 78 RPM records to ensure consistency across experiments. So these 78s are in Harvard's archive, and I'm currently trying to get them re-recorded digitally so I can incorporate those as sonic material as well. The topic interests me as a subject for a sound piece for CD or possibly LP for a number of reasons. One is that it's part of the darker history of the development of electronic audio technology, and in turn the development of electroacoustic music. So we have to acknowledge that the oscillators, noise generators, and filters found in the classic early electronic music studios of the 50s and 60s were not far removed from the kind of equipment developed for military ends during wartime conditions, even if we might not want to follow completely the media historian Friedrich Hitler's technological determinism, or his general idea that, quote, the entertainment industry is, in any conceivable sense of the word, an abuse of army equipment. Another is that psychologists in the Psychoacoustic Lab were key figures in the so-called cognitive revolution of the mid-1950s and the subsequent development of the field of cognitive psychology. Much of the research on, for example, language and memory for decades then was based on the problematic paradigm of the human mind as an information processing device, as a kind of computer. And this has its roots in this wartime research on the cybernetic human-machine units of pilots and communication networks. But for me, the main impetus to pursue this project as a sound piece is that the historical development of Western new music and sound art owes a very specific debt to the Electroacoustic Lab, which has to do with their having built the first anechoic chamber, a room designed to completely absorb any reflections of sound, which is also insulated against external sound. John Cage's visit to this place was an event that famously influenced his thinking about silence and listening. And here's John Cage telling the story himself on his 1959 record with David Tudor called Indeterminacy. And on this record, all the stories are exactly 1 minute long, so if they're short stories, he tells them very slowly, and if it's a long story, it's spoken very quickly.
It was after I got to Boston that I went into the anechoic chamber at Harvard University. Anybody who knows me knows this story. I am constantly telling it. Anyway, In that silent room, I heard two sounds, one high and one low. Afterward, I asked the engineer in charge why, if the room was so silent, I had heard two sounds. He said, "Describe them." I did. He said, "The high one was your nervous system in operation. The low one was your blood in circulation."
So another strain of my sound work has to do with physical infrastructure of various kinds, including sewage treatment, waste disposal and recycling, transportation networks. I'll present one of these. It's called Swiss Mountain Transport Systems, and grew out of an experience of living in Switzerland for part of a year with my partner Helen Mira, who had a year-long residency there. She's an artist whose practice at that time involved walking in the mountains and collecting rocks. And in participating in this walking and in carrying the rocks, I became interested in the transportation infrastructure that allowed us to get to the mountain paths. So in deciding where we would go, since Helen was interested in rocks, she would research the geologic features in the different parts of the Alps, and I would research the forms and vintages of the kinds of transportation that we could take to get there. In Switzerland, there's a comprehensive transportation network, which includes not only train lines connecting the cities to the to the towns, to the tiny villages which are scattered about in the mountains, but also gondolas or cable cars, like this one built in 1934. Funiculars or cogwheel railways, like this one from 1910. And in the Jura, the last remaining sideways-facing chairlift, or Quersitzbahn, built in 1950. And that's what we're hearing going over us. Sideways-facing chairlift, Quersitzbahn. So for over 100 years, this network has been being built. And it's important to note that for the ones I'm talking about, they're not ski lifts, but rather many serve as year-round daily means of transportation for residents of villages built high up in the mountains. And in fact, even in the city of Zurich, there are gondolas that are part of the public transportation network and totally integrated into the life of the city. So I was immediately interested in the mechanical sound of the transportation systems, but discovered, of course, that the recordings were at least as much about the social and geographical situatedness or context of those sounds. It's a reminder that a study about anything is about many things, about interrelationships. And there's, of course, a multi-layeredness. In these pieces, the ear, as I was saying before, can wander, so to speak, between foreground and background. There's a simultaneity of motion and stillness with a steady movement of the cable car through space, sometimes buffeted by wind, where the open windows allow transient acoustic glimpses of a vast surrounding landscape inhabited by humans and other animals. The first iteration, I'll play a bit of this in a minute, but first I'll just say that, and this I think will be the last thing I present so that we can have a little time for talking. But the first iteration of the project was a live performance in a gallery in Kyoto, where I used as my instrument the unprocessed location recordings, and Helen played minimal percussion. And then there were 4 subsequent versions. I was really interested in this body of material, so we made a number of iterations of it.